As they're going, why don't you go ahead and grab a Bible, and you can turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 20. That's a really easy book of the Bible. If you're new to church, just open the front cover. You'll see Genesis, and you just kind of keep going, and you'll get to Exodus, the second book of the Bible, and we'll be in chapter 20 this morning. Like I mentioned, we're starting a brand new series for the fall about the Ten Commandments. And so we're going to take all the way up until Christmas, and we're going to study these 10 commandments, what they mean for us. And it's interesting, as the 10 commandments is an interesting topic when you talk about it with, different people. Years ago, most people, like if you've been a Christian and you're a little bit older, most people, 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you would ask any kind of church-going person, can you name the 10 commandments? Years ago, most people would be able to name, if not all 10, like 8 or 9 of them, right? They at least kind of have this working knowledge of what the 10 commandments were. Many churches actually 30, 40 years ago would use the 10 commandments to teach new believers, to teach children, okay, what is the moral law? What does God require of us? But I think in more recent years, lots of people actually don't even know what the 10 commandments are. Even just a few weeks ago around the dinner table, I asked my kids, hey kids, we're starting a new sermon series at church on the 10 commandments. Okay, can any of you name some of the commandments? Okay, so this is me confessing. These are like pastor's kids, right? And they were like, And then Ruby, my middle child, said, I think it's like love God and then love other people. And I'm like, kind of. You've just summed up all of them, yes. But can you name like specific ones? And they really couldn't. And so we walked through each one. This is commandment number 4. This is number 5. And they just went, oh, okay, interesting. But right, years ago, most people would have possibly known all 10. I've memorized the 10 commandments. It just gets even more interesting as you talk about this topic. 8 states in the United States in recent years, actually, Oklahoma, Arkansas, other ones, removed statues of the 10 commandments from either Capitol grounds or court buildings or things like that. And it was always a big news story. The crane comes and they remove the 10 commandments from in front of the Capitol grounds, and there was always Christians protesting, you can't remove the 10 commandments. And I always would watch it and go, they know that those aren't the real ones, right? Right, who cares? Take the statue away. Right, it would be like, okay, we have a statue for gravity, and now you're removing the statue for gravity, and we all go, oh no, there's no more gravity. No, it's just a statue, right? But there was this kind of pushback, and you're removing religion from the social square, and that's not allowed, and there was all of this kind of back and forth about the 10 commandments. Do they belong in society? Even 10 years ago, right, if you've ever watched debates between atheists and Christians, lots of times the Christian argument will be, okay, well, atheist, you believe in no God. What's your basis for morality? Like, where do you get your morality from? And lots of times atheists will try and come up with answers. We don't need a God to tell us what's right and wrong. We don't need a God to define morality for us. Even, 10 years ago, there was a CNN article that came out called, Behold, the Atheist's New 10 Commandments. And so it was a journalist who said, look, and they called them, these are the non-commandments, trying to prove you don't need God to have the 10 commandments. Look, these are the new non-commandments. So here they are. Here's the 10 atheists' non-commandments. Number 1, be open-minded and be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence. Number 2, strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true. 3, the scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. 4, every person has the right to control of their body. Number 5, God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life. 6, be mindful of the consequences of your actions and recognize that you must take responsibility for them. 7, treat others as you would want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. Think about their perspective. 8, we have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations. 9, there is no right or one right way to live. And 10, leave the world a better place than you found it. And you might look at that, some of you sitting here, and go, those sound really nice. But do you realize this is a huge mess? For one, several of their non-commandments contradict each other. Number 5, we don't need God to be a good person. Number 7, do unto others as you would have them do. Where is that from? Jesus! We don't need God, and yet we will borrow from Jesus to create our non-commandments. You're not allowed to do that, right? So they contradict each other. Even number 3, the scientific method, kind of, engineered by Francis Bacon. It was actually Christians who most rejoiced over the scientific method. Presbyterian, Anglican, other denominations said, thank you. Finally, we have a more reliable way to understand this world that God has created. And the fact that they call, these are non-commands, and yet every single one of them is a command. And so number 9, there's no right way to live. Well, what if my right way to live is to disobey all the other non-commandments? What are you going to do about it? Right, so you see the whole idea of, we don't need a God and we'll create our own non-commandments. It just is foolishness. It makes no sense. Even how Christians interact with the 10 Commandments is really interesting as you kind of either search online or just talk with people. Some Christians would ask the question, well, why study the law? Isn't that the Old Testament? Aren't we under grace? Like when I talked with a few people, hey, we're studying the 10 Commandments for the fall, one of the first questions I got from someone was, why? That's like the Old Testament, right? Does that not apply to us? Aren't we like under grace now and it's all about Jesus? Why would we spend like 2.5 months studying the 10 Commandments? Right? There's kind of this dichotomy that some people have. Well, that's the old stuff and that doesn't really apply to us. We need to like unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament, if you know what I'm talking about. Some just let it go, that's fine. Some Christians water down the 10 Commandments with that kind of attitude. It's just law, we don't need to follow it anymore. And that inevitably leads to liberalism. If you look at, liberal churches, inevitably they're like, we don't really have to follow the rules. It's just about your feelings and all that kind of stuff. Inevitably, that will lead to liberalism. Now, on the flip side, there's some Christians who just really want to rub your face in the law, and they take the law and they just beat you over the head with it. And that inevitably leads to fundamentalism and this idea that you must earn your salvation and things of that matter. And so listen, even among Christians, there's like some confusion over what are the 10 Commandments? Are they for us today? Do we obey them? Do we not? So this morning, I want to answer some of those questions. We're not going to dive into the first specific commandment. This is kind of an overview this morning, but I want to ask 3 questions that hopefully will kind of lay the groundwork for the rest of our series. So the 3 questions are this: what are the 10 Commandments for? Like, why do they exist? Why did God give them to us? Secondly, why should we obey them? And then thirdly, how do you and I actually go about doing that? Right? So this morning really is, the what, why, and the how concerning the 10 Commandments. So let me read Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17, and then we'll just kind of start breaking down those questions as we move forward. So it says this, verse 1, "And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. The word of the Lord. Now, already I know some of you are like, well, I don't have an ox. My neighbor doesn't own a donkey. I don't have a female servant or a male servant. Like, how does this apply to us? And we're going to unpack that in the weeks to come, the principles that exist for us. But for sure, this was written in a culture that is vastly different to us. And so, yes, many of us don't have livestock or donkeys or things like that. But I think these commandments still apply to us today. So a bit of background for us to kind of understand the context of when God gave these commandments to his people. Actually, in the original language, the 10 Commandments, that phrase is not really used. They're simply called the 10 words. So in Exodus 34, and Deuteronomy 4, and Deuteronomy 10, whenever the 10 Commandments are talked about, the Hebrew word is just God gave his people 10 words. So let me back up in case you're not aware of the story, but Israel, the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And then God intervened, sent Moses. If you remember the story, the 10 plagues happened. And God was basically in this kind of head-to-head match, God versus Pharaoh. And they went 10 rounds, and God sent 10 plagues. And finally, after the 10 plagues, or the 10th one rather, Pharaoh gives in and says, okay, fine, let the Israelites go. And so God miraculously saves his people, right? They go, the Red Sea parts, and the Israelites walk through the Red Sea on dry land, and then they go out into the wilderness. And this moment, Exodus 20, is now 50 days after. So the Passover, where, right, the angel of death passed over the Israelites and God saved them, 50 days has gone by, and now they're at the base of this mountain called Sinai, and God is going to give the law to his people. They would call this, years later, they would celebrate kind of like a festival, a celebration called Pentecost, which the word Pentecost just means the 50th. And it would be celebrating this. They would celebrate the gift of the law, right? They would celebrate Passover. Hey, God redeemed us. He saved us from Israel. And then 50 days later, they would celebrate Pentecost, where what was the celebration? God gave us the law, right? See, sometimes I think we have a wrong view of the law, that we're like, oh, the law is terrible. The people of Israel celebrated every year Pentecost. Yes, God gave us the law at Mount Sinai. So part of the law was these 10 words, these 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments are quite unique compared to the rest of the law. In total, if you read the whole law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, if you read the whole law, there's something like 613 commandments in all of it. But these specific 10 words, these 10 commandments, are very unique for a couple of reasons. Number one is that they were audibly delivered by God himself. For the rest of the law, God gave the law to Moses, and then Moses went and he presented the law to the Israelites. But with the 10 commandments, God audibly spoke these to all the people. We're told this in Deuteronomy 4. Moses writes this, "Then the Lord spoke to you." He's speaking to Israel. "The Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the 10 commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone." So these 10 words are unique because all the people of Israel heard a voice from Mount Sinai delivering these 10 words to them. The other unique thing about the 10 Commandments is that they were written by God himself on 2 tablets of stone. In Exodus 31, it says this: he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Now again, whatever that looks like, man, oh man, could you imagine seeing that? But these 10 words are unique because God spoke all of them to all of his people, and then he wrote them himself on these tablets of stone. So that leads us to our first question. Okay, God has given these 10 words to his people. Well, what are they for? What are these 10 commandments for? Why would God give these specific words to his people? And I think there's a few answers to this. Why do the 10 commandments exist? What are they for? Well, number one, it's to show us who God is. These 10 reveal something about the character and the heart of our God. These 10 teach us about his honor and his worth and his majesty. These 10 show us, okay, what matters to God, right? If you would ask, okay, what is important? What does God value? What matters to him? You could go to these 10 commandments and get answers to those questions. This is who God is. So for instance, the first 3 commandments: you shall have no other gods, no carved images, no taking the Lord's name in vain. Well, what do those commandments teach us about God? Well, they show us the glory of our God, his holiness and his worth. It teaches us that there actually is no other God. It teaches us that we shouldn't attempt to say, you know what, I'm going to cut down a tree and I'm going to carve an image and then I'll worship the image because that's who God is. That commandment teaches us, oh, actually you can't do that. He is so far above any kind of created thing that you could make. So right, there's commandments teaching us how to live. But above that, they're going, this is who your God is. The commandment to not murder. What does that teach us? Well, it teaches us that God actually values human life. Human beings are image bearers. Every single human being has dignity and worth and value because they're created in the image of God. And so what does that teach us about God? Oh, God values his creation. He values human life. The commandment to not commit adultery, what does that teach us? Well, what is the opposite of adultery? It's faithfulness, right? If you commit adultery, you're being unfaithful. So the opposite of that is that you are faithful. So what does that teach us about God? God is faithful time and time and time again. Actually, many times in the Old Testament, he uses the illustration, my people are like a bride and I'm like a groom, and my people have been unfaithful. But always God says, I will be faithful to them. Even the commandment to not bear false witness or to lie, what does that teach us about God? Well, our God is the way, the truth, and the life. There is no darkness in him. God will not lie. He does not change. You don't have to worry that he'll say one thing and then do the other. So that commandment reveals something about God, right? God is not a liar. He's truthful. Everything he says is true. So I think perhaps most importantly, these 10 commandments reveal an awful lot about the God that you and I serve and worship. Secondly, what do the 10 commandments exist for? Well, they exist to show us how to live abundantly. These 10 words are meant to enhance our freedom. It was interesting, I have this view of the 10 commandments of just, these are the 10 rules, don't do these things, and almost like God was this angry God who just gave us a set of arbitrary rules. But then I would read in the Psalms, and David would write, I delight in the law of God. And I would go, why would you delight in something that is awful? It's just restricting your freedom. So I said, there must be something there that many times the psalmist would write, oh, I love the law of God. Because the 10 commandments are actually meant to show us, hey, do you want to have an abundant, flourishing life? Here's how you do it. Deuteronomy 5:29 says, "Oh, that they had such a mind as this always, to fear me and to keep all my commandments, that it might go well with them and with their descendants forever." Do you want it to go well with you and for your kids and your grandkids? Oh, that you would have a heart to obey these commandments. I asked someone recently, trying to imagine a society that said, okay, you know what, we're going to honor God, we're going to obey God, we're going to make sure that we rest every week, we're going to be faithful to our spouses, we're not going to steal, we're not going to be dishonest, I'm not going to envy or covet what's not mine, I'm going to honor my parents. For us, we can't even imagine. That sounds like a utopian society. We look around our world and we're like, man, we are breaking all the commandments. Right, we can't even imagine. Imagine that. Imagine a people group, a nation, a country, the world, whatever, that said, no, you know what? We're going to do these things. We're going to be faithful to our spouses. We're not going to commit adultery. I'm not going to be jealous or envious or steal things from my neighbor. I'm going to be satisfied in what I have. I'm going to just rest every week. I'm going to take a day and just rest and be with my family and be with the Lord. Man, oh man, that society would flourish, would it not? So God has given these 10 commandments because he goes, this is what an abundant life actually looks like, right? Freedom is not just the freedom to do whatever you want. Freedom is found in what God has designed for us. So these 10 commandments exist to show us, here's what it looks like to actually be free. Thirdly, why do the 10 commandments exist? Well, they exist to show us our sinfulness, right? Because we can idyllically look at these and go, yes, that's the full possible life. But if you're like me, then you look at them and you go, I've broken all of these. So the 10 commandments exist to reveal the heart of human rebellion, right? When you actually take them and you hold them up like a mirror to your own heart, you go, I fail. I think the 10 commandments show us that we actually don't like God telling us what we can and cannot do. So listen, if you're a parent and you have children, you'll know that lots of times your children don't like you telling them what to do. Yes? And if you say no, you're a liar, and that's one of the 10 commandments, okay? But it's just true. I will tell my kids to do some things sometimes, and it's just like, no, I don't want to do that. Go clean your room. No, I don't want to, right? Inherently in human beings, there's this, because of our sinful nature, there's this bent towards, I don't want people telling me what to do. Listen, it's not just kids. You all adults, you don't like people telling you what you can and cannot do. And so the 10 commandments, they reveal this sinful heart of ours. Paul even talks about the law in Romans 7:7. He says, what shall we say, that the law is sin? By no means, right? It's not the law's problem that we're like, this is too hard, I can't do it, I hate it. That's not the law's problem, that's an us problem. So is the law sin? By no means, yet, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So do you get what Paul's saying? He's saying you read the law and you go, you shall not covet, and then you put the law down and then you look at your neighbor and you go, I want their car. So what does the law do? Because we're so sinful, it just shows us how sinful we are, right? I look at the law and I go, you shall not do this, and then I turn around and I go, but I want to do that. See, it's not the law's problem. Elsewhere in the book of Romans, Paul says that the law is good and holy and righteous. It's not the law's problem. It's our problem. The law isn't sinful, but what it does is it exposes our sinfulness, because we read these 10 commandments and we go, I can't keep this. I am a rebel. Especially, and we'll get to this as we go through the series, but when Jesus comes and then he actually raises the bar. He doesn't lower the bar on the law, he raises the bar. Because, right, some of us could look at this and go, okay, you shall not commit adultery. I've never done that. I've been faithful to my spouse. And then Jesus comes and he says, actually, if you've looked at a woman lustfully, you're an adulterer. And so everyone goes, guilty. And then, right, you should go down in verse 13, you shall not murder. Okay, I've never murdered anyone. And then Jesus comes along, he says, actually, if you're angry with your brother, it's the same thing. Right, even elsewhere in the New Testament, in the book of James, it says, if you break one commandment, you're guilty of them all. So the point of the 10 Commandments is we look at them and we go, we can't keep these. Right? We can delight in them and we see the good in them. We see that it's for our flourishing, but because of our sinfulness, I just can't keep these. So fourthly then, the 10 Commandments exist to show us our need for a mediator. Right? The standard of the law, we look at it, God says, here's what it means to be holy. Here's the standard. And we go, well, we just can't keep it. And so we go, we need someone who can mediate between us and God. We need someone who can come and fix this problem that we have. Even you see that in Exodus 20. Keep reading verse 18. God gives these 10 words, and then it says, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So do you see, even in that moment, God's holiness, and he gives these 10 words, and what's the response of the people? Moses, you talk to us. Don't let God talk to us. Why? He's too holy. Right, so you see, like, we need a mediator, and Moses was that mediator in the old covenant. He went to God, and then he would bring the law back to the people, and he mediated between God and man. But right at the beginning even, here's the standard. We are unable to meet the standard. We need a go-between. We need someone. And so the law shows us that. Right, so why does this exist? Well, the 10 Commandments exist because they reveal who our God is. They show us this is what an abundant, full, flourishing life actually looks like. But then the 10 Commandments reveal our own sinfulness, that we are unable to do this. And then it shows us we need someone. We need someone to come between us and God. We just can't do this on our own. So that leads to our second question then. Okay, that's what they're for, but question 2 is, well, why should we obey them? Or should we? Throughout this series in the fall, I'm going to be making the case that Christians, followers of Jesus, should seek to obey the 10 Commandments. But the why is so important. And you've heard me say it before if you've attended here, but your motivation for obedience matters immensely. So I will be making the case that, you know what, as followers of Jesus, we should strive to obey the 10 Commandments. But why? Why should we? Because if you obey for the wrong reasons, right? If your motivation for obedience is wrong, and then you have the wrong end for your obedience, you will inevitably live out your relationship with God the wrong way. Because your motivation matters, right? So if you approach the 10 Commandments and you go, okay, I'm going to obey because God will be really pleased with me and I will somehow earn my salvation and my standing before God, that is going to mess with your relationship with him. Because the motivation is all wrong. So we should obey, but why should we obey? Well, firstly, I think we should obey because God knows what is best for humans. God created us. He is our creator and sustainer. He knows what makes human beings tick. He knows how we will best function in his created order. Like, God is all-knowing, all-powerful. He's the creator and designer of all things. So it makes sense that he would know, okay, what is best for human beings. And so actually to go against these 10 words is not just, okay, well, now you're disobeying, but it means that you're going against the very fabric of how God designed you. So it's like God is saying to his people, okay, here's how you will operate most effectively as a human being made in my image. Here is the way that will bring you the most flourishing and satisfaction in life. So listen, these commandments are not just like arbitrary decisions that God made. It's not like he's like, okay, I got 8, I got to get to 10 because that's a nice even number, and I'll just invent 2 more. They're not just arbitrary decisions. So like think of a few of them. So Sabbath, not some arbitrary decision, right? It's not as if God was just like, you know what, okay, why don't you work, I don't know, 6 days and then take a day off. Right, and we're going to get into, because this is probably the one that most people were like, I'm excited for what you're going to say. Is Sabbath Saturday? Is it Sunday? Do we keep it? Do we not? Blah, blah, blah. Did Constantine change it? And now Sunday is the mark of the beast and all this nonsense. We're going to get into that, but what's most important? Not that God just said, you know what, every 6 days take a day off. What the Sabbath teaches us is you need rest. Right? You're not designed as a human being to go, go, go. But that's the world we live in, is it not? Actually, one of the authors I read said that he thinks one of the main issues with all of the rise of depression and anxiety and all of these problems in our society is because we don't know how to rest. We just go and go and go. And I have Christian leadership books that say, as a pastor, you got to hustle and you got to earn it and you got to work hard and never rest. And it's just nonsense. You weren't made for that. You were made to work and then rest. It's in the fabric of your being. That is how you will most flourish. I heard a story recently this is a true story. There was a company that was given 2 projects that were almost identical in, the scope and the size of them. And so the company assigned one team to this project and one team to this project. And the foreman or the whatever of this team said, okay, you know what? We're going to get this project done. We're going to work hard. We're going to work long days. And we're not going to stop until we finish it. Because if we finish it fast, then we get money and we're done. And this team, the foreman said, actually, we're going to work hard, but then I'm going to actually give you time off. And you're going to go home and you're going to spend time with your wife and your children. And then you're going to come back and be refreshed and go. Which project do you think got done quicker? The one where they rested. And you would go, well, wait, but if I just go until it's done, I will end up finishing faster. But you know what happened? Mistakes were made. Men got sick because their bodies weren't resting. Machinery broke down. And these guys, they would work hard and then they would go home and they would see their families. They would rest and they would come back and work even harder. And you go, man, it's almost like God knows what he's talking about. Even if you think about the commandment of adultery, it's not some arbitrary rule where God goes, ha, now I'll ruin all their fun. Like, that's not what God's doing. He's not saying, I'm just going to make it super difficult for all of you. Do you know what the commandment of not committing adultery shows you? You were designed for faithfulness. You're designed for fidelity. You are not designed as a human being to go and sleep around with partner after partner after partner. It will destroy you. So God's not trying to ruin your fun. He's trying to enhance and make your life flourish. But listen, even the way Christians talk about it, I remember being in youth group and being taught, okay, almost trying to scare you. Sex is bad. You'll die. Don't do it. And then Christians get married and they're like, okay, now you can have fun. And you're like, what? I'm so confused. Rather than, hey, sex is this unbelievable gift that God has given you, and he has designed you to be faithful, one man, one woman, until one of you dies. And man, if you enjoy the gift in that context, your life will flourish. We're meant for faithfulness. So you might notice as we go through, commandments 1 through 3 are meant and designed to protect and enhance our relationship with God. Commandment 4 is meant to protect and enhance a balanced life of work and rest. And commandments 5 through 10 are meant to protect and enhance our relationship with our community. So why should we obey them? Because God knows what's best for us. Now, secondly, why should we obey the commandments? Well, we obey because we love God. You'll be surprised how many times in the New Testament it says, here is an evidence that you love God, you will obey him. So 1 John 5, John writes this, by this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. Isn't that amazing? Like sometimes I read the commands of Jesus and I'm like, they feel pretty burdensome sometimes. But John can say, right, he can write and say, do you want to know what the love of God looks like played out in your life? It's when you obey him. And guys, his commandments are not burdensome. Even Jesus himself in John 14:15 said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. See, I think sometimes we have this idea that, okay, well, like obedience, that was the Old Testament, and now it's just about like just the feeling of love that I have for Jesus. But listen, there's teeth to it in the New Testament. Okay, that's great. You love Jesus. How is that going to show up in your life? Well, it should show up that you delight in obeying him. I've had conversations with Christians, one recently that comes to mind. This individual was walking away and living a life of willful disobedience. I'm going to go and I'm going to live this way. And the conversation we had is like, I'm just feeling so great about my relationship with Jesus that I'm really growing. And I had to say, you are not growing. It is a lie to think that you can willfully disobey God and say, but he's cool with me. We love each other. The evidence of you loving God is that you will delight in obeying him. So why should we obey the commands of God? Is because he knows what's best for us and because it's an evidence of our love for him. Now, lastly, and this is so important, okay, well then how do you and I actually do this? How are we going to live with this? And this has to do with the proper motivation. Because listen, if we left and throughout the whole series, all you heard was, okay, I got to try really hard to obey now, then I have failed, right? If you leave and all the takeaway is just buckle down and obey hard, then I have miscommunicated because this is the motivation. How do we actually have proper motivation? And what do we remember as we seek to obey Jesus? A few things. If you're going to obey these 10 commandments, one is that you have to remember that grace always comes before obedience. Always. If you would ask just random people, okay, can you tell me, how do the 10 commandments start? Most people would go, you shall have no other gods before me. That's not how the 10 commandments start. If you look at verse 2, here's how the 10 commandments start. God says to his people, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It starts by God saying, hey, I'm already Yahweh. I am already your God. Notice that he doesn't say, I will be your God if you obey. He says to his people, I'm the God who already saved you. I redeemed you from Egypt. So listen, the 10 commandments are not instructions for how Israel can get out of Egypt. The 10 commandments are rules for a free people to stay free. God has already saved and redeemed Israel. God didn't come to the Israelites in slavery and go, okay, if you obey these commandments, then I will come and rescue you. Here's the 10 commandments. I'm going to be back in a few years. I'll check up on if you're keeping them. And then if you've done really good, then I will save you. No, he saves his people. He redeems his people. And then he says, I am the Lord your God. I'm Yahweh. I've saved you already. Now this is how I want you to live. See, sometimes we have this wrong view of the Old Testament where we go, well, the Old Testament is all law and there's no grace. That is not true. God has always, by grace, saved his people. The Israelites did not deserve to be saved from Egypt. And yet God saves them and he says, okay, now here's how I want you to live. You are a free people. You are my people. Now here's how you live. Salvation is never the reward for obedience. Salvation is the reason for obedience. And so the same is true for us. God, thousands of years later, sends his son, and Jesus goes to the cross, and he bears the punishment for us, and God saves us by his grace. And then what we're told time and time again in the New Testament is, okay, in light of your salvation, in light of your faith in Jesus, here's how you need to live. So listen, if you're going to obey the 10 Commandments, you must remember that. You are not saved by how well you obey. Right? God has saved you by grace alone, through his son, through faith in Jesus, and now our obedience is in response to what God has already done. The second thing to remember, if you're going to obey the 10 Commandments, is you have to remind yourself that Jesus has already obeyed fully for you. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus tells us as much. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So notice that Jesus didn't come and say, okay, the law is bad, you don't have to do that anymore. Jesus says, actually, the law is good, and I haven't come to throw any of it away, but what does Jesus come to do? He says, I've come to fulfill all of it. So Jesus obeys perfectly, right? We talked about a mediator. Jesus is the mediator who comes and says, okay, humanity is failing miserably at obeying God's commandments. Jesus says, I'm going to obey for them. I will be the mediator, right? And so he doesn't just obey the 10 commandments. Jesus faithfully obeys the 613 commandments in the Old Testament. And he obeys perfectly, and then he goes to the cross, and the wrath of God is poured out onto him for our failure to obey, our sinfulness. And Jesus is raised from the dead, and he defeats sin and death. And so the death and resurrection of Jesus is crucial for our salvation, but so is his righteous life. Because Scripture tells us that not only does Jesus forgive you and then say, okay, I've forgiven you, you have a clean slate, now don't mess it up. No, Jesus says, I've forgiven you, and now if you're in me, here is my righteousness. It's called imputed righteousness. It's righteousness that doesn't come from you. It's righteousness that is given to you. So as you strive to obey God, you must know he's not in heaven with a checklist going, number 3, broke it. He looks at you and says, perfect. You are righteous. The righteousness of Jesus you are wearing as a robe. You are perfect in my eyes. You must remember that. God is not going to judge you on how well you obey the law. He judges you on how well Jesus obeyed the law. And if you're in him, you're perfect in God's eyes. So anytime you approach the 10 Commandments, you must remember that, or else the weight of it will crush you. If you still think that somehow God's looking at my performance and I have to measure up. Third thing to remember as you seek to obey Jesus, you must remember that Jesus forgives you. Because we look at the 10 and we see the moral requirements and we fail. And we will still fail. And so you must remind yourself, when I fail, Jesus forgives me. Like Colossians 2 says, and you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all of our trespasses. By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, this he set aside, nailing it to the cross. Listen, Jesus forgives all of your sin, past, present, and future. So when we fail, right, we strive to obey Jesus, we strive to obey God because we love him. And when we inevitably fall down and fail, we don't go, okay, game over, I guess I'm out. You pick yourself up and you run to the loving, forgiving arms of Jesus. He's nailed your debt to the cross. You have to remember that. that Jesus forgives you. And then fourthly, how are we going to do this? This is potentially one of the most exciting things, is that Jesus actually empowers you to do this. Jesus has given you the Holy Spirit to live inside of you. If you're a follower of Jesus, you have the presence of the living God in you. This is a fulfillment of Jeremiah 31. If you remember that prophecy, long before Jesus came, long before the Holy Spirit was given, there was this prophecy that God gave that said, one day I'm going to put my Spirit inside my people. I'm going to take out this heart of stone that they have, and I'm going to give them a heart of flesh, and I'm going to pour out my Spirit on them, and I am going to be with my people forever. God said, I'm going to write the law on their hearts, actually. It's not going to be on stone tablets. My law is actually going to be written on their hearts, and they're going to long to obey me. And then Pentecost comes, right? 50 days after Jesus is raised from the dead, the feast of Pentecost, where the Israelites would celebrate the giving of the law. And on that day, on Pentecost, God fulfills his promise and the Holy Spirit is given, and he writes his law on our hearts. This is why in Romans 8, Paul writes, for God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. See, the law is good, but it's our own flesh. We can't do it. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So listen, you and I, if you're a follower of Jesus, we don't just white knuckle it. Okay, in my own strength, I just have to try really, really, really hard not to commit any of these things, and I have to try so hard on my own to obey the 10 Commandments. No, the point of Jesus and the Spirit is that God changes your heart and he changes your desires. And like 1 John 5, we go, actually, obeying God is not burdensome. I delight in obeying him. Listen, no human being that doesn't have the Spirit would ever say that. I delight obeying God, but the Spirit comes and he changes your heart and you go, I desire what God desires. I just delight in obeying him. So listen, Jesus has empowered you to live like this. So a couple of things as we walk through this series. This is my hope. Firstly, that we would just learn about our great and awesome and holy God. That each week we would study one of these commandments and go, who is like the Lord our God? No one. Secondly, that you would begin to delight in God's pattern and design for humanity. That as we go through the series, our heart's cry would be similar to 1 John 5, that we would go, actually, this is not burdensome. I delight in God's standard. I see the good of it. I see God's pattern and his design. I see his grace to me that this was designed for my life to flourish. But I think perhaps most importantly, I would long as we study the 10 Commandments that as a church we would say, no, we long to obey God, but we long to obey God in response to the saving grace that was given to us in Christ Jesus. Look, he is the Lord our God. He saved us. He redeemed us. I long to obey him in response to that. That we would be a people that say, you know what, we love Jesus, and that love is evident by our changed hearts longing to desire or desiring to obey everything that God has for us. So, Father, I just thank you that thousands of years ago, you met with your people at Mount Sinai. That God, you came down and you had already saved them from Egypt. God, I just thank you for your grace, evident all throughout the Old Testament. That God, you did not come to your people Israel and say, okay, I'm going to save you on these conditions. If you obey, if you do the right things, then I will come and save you. But God, you saved them solely by an act of pure grace. you redeemed them from slavery. And you brought them out into the wilderness, and then you said, I am the Lord your God. Here's how I want you to live. And God, the same is true for us. Jesus, you came and you redeemed us from our slavery to sin and death and darkness. You brought us out, you brought us into your kingdom, and then you said, here's how I want you to live. So God, I just pray that as we study the Ten Commandments this fall, I pray, God, that you would just do a mighty work in us. I pray that we would learn things about you that maybe we've never seen before, that our understanding and our knowledge of who you are as our God and our King would just grow. God, I pray that we would begin to delight in your commandments, that we would say, oh, these are for our good. And God, I pray that we would learn to obey you in response to this great gift of salvation that you've given us. That as we study these 10 commandments, that we wouldn't just leave with this idea of, okay, now I have to try really, really hard in my own strength to somehow impress God, but that we would go, no, I'm clothed in the righteousness of Jesus, and because of this great, enormous, undeserved gift that God has given me, I long to obey him. So God, only you can do that work in each one of our hearts, and so we ask that you would just help us to grow this fall more and more into the image of your Son. And so we just pray all of this in your mighty name, Jesus. Amen.